Hello everybody, this is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, March 2nd. This will be the Week 8 announcement for Political Science 1013 on the 16-week schedule for the spring 2025 term. Okay everybody, we have a couple of things this week, including your midterm exam. I want to say quite a bit about that, but there are a couple other things going on. I am recording videos this afternoon, and as soon as I finish with that, I will be grading your discussion 3, and that should be up on the website sometime today, Sunday the 2nd. Yeah, not too much longer. It shouldn't take too long to do. I sent a message out about the Tuesday night presidential address to a joint session of Congress. That's going to be offered as an extra credit for both the 8-week and the 16-week sections. And everybody, I mentioned the 8-week people are finishing up this week. So they've got quite a bit to do. So perhaps this section, more you will be able to do that. But if you can work that in and take a look at it, as I mentioned, it could be done after the fact if absolutely necessary. But that will be taking place 8 o'clock our time, or a few minutes after 8. You want to tune in around 8. Tuesday night, the 4th, on many, many networks, broadcast and cable, I'm sure. Just look at it, summarize the main points, what you think is important in a paragraph or so, and email to me for 5 points extra credit. Okay, now after that, Thursday, we have the midterm exam. Okay, exam 2, the midterm exam covering units 3 and 4. Okay, now we had begun on unit 4 last time, and I wanted to finish up and then discuss the 4 outside readings I've asked you to do to be looked up online before we wind up today. Okay, we had gotten last time through the first 7 articles of the Constitution, I believe. Now, there are a total of 27 amendments. We're not going to discuss all of them. Look into those on your own time if you want, but I felt for our purposes the most important are the Bill of Rights, then the 3 Civil War amendments that were added right after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, especially the 14th Amendment. And then I have recently added a bit about the 25th Amendment because that came up during the impeachment attempts against Trump. And it's worth looking at the 25th Amendment for a moment. Everybody, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech, okay, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Now, there are 2 things that the First Amendment says about religion. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And the interpretation of those is difficult because there's ambiguous language. There's 2 schools of thought on the First Amendment: accommodationist and separationist. Okay? Now, what it says in the Establishment Clause is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, that often has been interpreted as erecting a wall of separation between church and state, separation of church and state. But that phrase, wall of separation, is Thomas Jefferson's language in correspondence separate from the Constitution. That language is not in the Constitution. The interpretation is controversial. Religious conservatives have been upset about the strictness of the separation, and they want a more accommodationist interpretation, and the Supreme Court may do that in years to come. This Supreme Court, as it's constituted now, is friendlier than in the past, I would say, to an accommodationist interpretation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now, the Fourth Amendment has to do with search and seizure. Okay? Laying down guidelines for when you can and cannot be searched, or your property cannot be searched. Now, if you looked at the video links in the Unit 4 links message that I sent out, it's easier for them to search your car than your home, because the courts ruled, well, the car is portable and can get away easily, so the police need a little more leeway searching a car relative to your home. Okay. Notice it doesn't say that there absolutely can be no search without a warrant, but it lays down certain requirements for a search warrant if one is required. Then there is the Eighth Amendment that mentions a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishments, which raises the question in our time, is capital punishment cruel and unusual punishment? Well, the Supreme Court appeared inclined to rule that way at one point, but eventually reversed itself. That all happened back in the 1970s. So all 10 of those amendments are worth looking at, and I hope you will look at them all and what we have to say about them in the class notes, but especially the First, Fourth, and Eighth Amendments. Okay. Now, of the Civil War amendments, the 14th is most important. Okay. The 13th abolishes slavery. Okay. The 15th guarantees the right to vote may not be abridged on account of race or previous condition of servitude, as the 15th Amendment says. But the 14th Amendment is important. Some people say the 14th Amendment effectively gives us a new Constitution in many respects, although all it did was amend the Constitution that we have. You might say the 14th Amendment gives you a cause of action against your state government that you did not have before. Okay. The states have to recognize your right to due process of law and equal protection of the laws, and it must recognize certain privileges and immunities. Okay. And if you think your state government has not done that, then you could sue your state government and take them to federal court. That's how the public schools eventually were desegregated back in the 1950s, really about the time of my birth and well before your lifetimes. But that could not have been done, more than likely, without the 14th Amendment. Now then, the 25th Amendment was added shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy. President Kennedy died relatively quickly after being shot, but it was speculated that there might have been a difficult situation if he had lived on as an invalid. Okay. So it made provision for the vice president to be declared acting president under certain circumstances. Okay. And it was speculated that that might have been done near the end of President Trump's first term. In any case, it's something that many people regard as a constitutionally awkward provision. There are some difficulties with it that could get the country in trouble down the line if a situation like that were to arise. So take a look at that. Now then, move on to the end of that set of notes. We mentioned to you that we wanted you to look closely in the textbook at Chapter 2 and relatively briefly at 3, 4, and 5, because those three chapters discuss civil liberties, civil rights, and federalism, which are discussed relatively briefly in the class notes. Now, what I would say is this: we discussed several issues that arise with regard to both civil rights and civil liberties. Be sure you understand the difference between the two. Okay, you'll find a slide and a set of notes that goes into the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. So be sure you look at that and look at the discussions we provided, the different issues that have come up and are coming up in the area of civil rights and civil liberties. Now, federalism refers to the division of responsibility in the main between the states and the feds. Okay? The states and the feds are constitutionally fundamental. The states may create other governments, local governments, municipal governments, county governments, but the states and the feds are constitutionally fundamental. Now, the relationship changed considerably going back to the 1930s and 1940s and President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. What happened then and in the meantime is the feds started giving money to the states with strings attached. And it turned out most of the time this was an offer the states couldn't refuse. They've come to be dependent on this money with strings attached. So since there are strings attached, that puts the feds in a position to tell the states what to do if they want that money with strings attached. Okay. That's done by means of what we call federal grants in aid. And there are different kinds of grants in aid with more or fewer restrictions attached or strings attached, which we discuss that concept at the very end of the class notes. But we go through several areas of policy: higher education, elementary and secondary education, highways, welfare, healthcare. Okay. We talk about how the federal system changed from layer cake to marble cake federalism. In other words, with layer cake federalism, each level of government had its own layer or layers that it took care of, and they didn't mess with each other. Okay. Marble cake federalism, it runs together more because the feds are giving the states this money with strings attached in areas that before had been pretty much left exclusively to the states. But that's changed for 80 or 90 years now. It may change further under the Trump administration. What their plans are, they may attempt to try to roll back a good bit of what the feds are doing if they haven't done so already. So that kind of remains to be seen. But that then brings us to the end of the class notes for Unit 4 on the Constitution. So on your exam on Thursday, available all day Thursday, 45 minutes once you start it, it'll be like your previous exam. 50 items, mostly on Units 3 and 4, on the media and the Constitution, but then there are 4 articles to be looked at. Okay, and 10 or 15 items will come from those articles. Right, now there was one, and this one was from the Wall Street Journal, so you can access that through the McKee Library website, about the changes that Zuckerberg made to Facebook to end what a lot of people regarded as censorship. You may or may not agree that it was censorship, but Trump apparently was not happy with some of the statements made online that had been restricted or censored, if you will. And it looked like this was an effort on Zuckerberg's part to make Trump happy. And so take a look at that, see what you think of it. Then we have an article from the Atlantic Monthly. The mainstream media has already lost, and this is about media in general rather than just Facebook. The idea that old media, newspapers, and television are being supplanted by websites and by especially podcasts and social media platforms. Okay. Now, looking at the Constitution, we gave you an article from the Washington Post by George Will. And what George Will is talking about here is changes that have taken place in the separation of powers. Presidents have exercised a great deal of prerogative at the expense of Congress. And George Will is not entirely happy about that, I don't think. You may have noted, and I think we've noted in some of our remarks we've made to you, the Trump administration, Donald Trump, has issued a tremendous amount of executive orders, one after the other, dozens of them, to kick off his administration. And if Democrats are unhappy about that, George Will would more than likely say, well, the precedent for all that had been set going back to the Obama and Biden administrations and before. But there are many, many areas in which Congress has not acted, could not act, did not want to act, and have left it to the president to exercise presidential prerogative in those areas where perhaps presidents would not have done so decades ago. Now, the final thing we've asked you to look at is by Mr. Tassili from Reason Magazine, talking about the events you might remember going back to last year, the protests that took place on so many college campuses, especially at Columbia University in New York City, after the October 2023 terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel, and then Israel's response going into the Gaza Strip, which many people feel was heavy-handed and took too many lives, perhaps. And there were protests against that all over the country, especially at Columbia University. Okay. And what the protesters did and how the authorities responded to the protesters has been controversial. So Tassili lays down what he calls some ground rules for how that kind of thing ought to be conducted, what ought to be allowed and what should not be. So take a look at that. And that's the last thing you have to look at for the exam. Please try those links if you have not done so already. If you cannot access any of that material in those links, contact me. I'll try to get the material to you. But please don't wait until the last minute. The exam will be Thursday, the 6th, for 24 hours, 45 minutes once you begin it. Okay, everybody, that is all after the exam on Thursday. We will get some material out to you for exam 3. And we'll be talking to you once again about a week from now at this time. Good luck, stay hard. Contact me with any questions, problems, issues, or difficulties through the course website or at david.cole@opsu.edu. Thanks a lot.